Part 1. The Collision. The Burning of Sigtuna. It's a summer day in 1187 AD. The merchants of Sigtuna, Sweden's most prosperous city, are going about their business. This is the jewel of the Swedish kingdom, with churches reaching toward heaven, coins minting wealth, the archbishop's seat of power. The harbour bustles with trade ships. Life is good in this Viking descendant city. Then someone spots the sails. At first, perhaps, there's no alarm. Ships arrive daily. But these vessels move differently. They're fast, low to the water, and there are many of them, too many, and they're not following trade routes. They're assuming attack formations. The raiders beach their ships with practiced efficiency. Warriors pour onto Swedish soil, but these aren't rival Vikings or vengeful Slavs. These are Estonians from across the Baltic Sea, accompanied by Karelian allies. They've sailed deep into the heart of Sweden, navigating through the Stockholm archipelago, past every defensive position, into Lake Mälaren itself. What happens next will traumatize Swedish collective memory for centuries. Sigtuna burns. The archbishop flees for his life. If the chronicles are true, Archbishop Johannes is cut down before he can escape. Churches that took generations to build become infernos. The mint, the very symbol of Swedish economic power, is plundered. Coins that should have borne Swedish kings' faces will instead disappear across the Baltic. The invaders don't just raid, they systematically destroy. This isn't a quick smash and grab. This is a message. Stone churches, supposedly immune to pagan torches, somehow burn anyway. The Swedish chroniclers, writing about this decades later, can barely contain their horror and disbelief. Here's the thing that Swedish historians don't like to emphasize. The raiders got away, completely. These Estonian and Karelian forces sailed back through the same Swedish waters, past the same defensive positions, carrying their plunder home. No Swedish force could catch them. No Viking longship could match them. The mighty Vikings, terror of Europe, conquerors of kingdoms, the wolves of the sea, had just been out-raided in their own waters. And this wasn't even the first time. The Baltic chessboard. To understand how Estonians and Curonians turned the tables on the Vikings, you need to visualize the Baltic Sea not as empty water, but as a complex maritime highway system, and everyone wanted to control the intersections. Look at a map of the Baltic. It's not an open ocean. It's almost an enormous lake dotted with thousands of islands, riddled with archipelagos, sliced by straits and sounds. Every one of these geographic features could hide a fleet. Every strait could become a trap. Every island could serve as a forward base. The Estonian islands, particularly Saaremaa, which the Scandinavians called Ursel, sit like an unsinkable aircraft carrier in the middle of the Baltic's main trade routes. From Saaremaa, Estonian raiders could strike Denmark in days, Sweden in less, and control access to the Gulf of Finland entirely. The island's harbours could shelter hundreds of ships. Its forests provided unlimited shipbuilding materials. Its position was absolutely perfect for what modern military strategists would call sea denial operations. The Curonians controlled an equally strategic position. Their territory stretched along what's now the Latvian and Lithuanian coast, including the Curonian Spit. This 98-kilometre peninsula creates a massive lagoon. This gave them protected waters for shipbuilding and training, plus control of the Nemunas and Daugava river mouths. The Daugava, especially, was crucial. It was the highway to the Russian interior and, ultimately, to Byzantine wealth. But here's what made these positions truly dangerous. The locals knew every current, every seasonal wind pattern, every hidden rock. Estonian pilots could navigate their archipelagos in fog that would wreck foreign ships. Curonians knew exactly when and where the ice would form, turning the winter Baltic into a highway for some, a death trap for others. Archaeological evidence from this period is stunning. At Salme on Saaremaa, we found ship burials from the 8th century AD containing Scandinavian-style swords and Estonian artifacts mixed together. This suggests these maritime cultures were already closely interacting, learning from each other, and probably killing each other centuries before Sigtuna burned. Harbour fortifications dating from the Viking Age have been found all along the Estonian coast. These aren't primitive wooden palisades. They're sophisticated defensive systems, designed specifically to protect naval bases. At Valgela, on Saaremaa, archaeologists have uncovered a massive stone fortress that could shelter an entire fleet and its crews. The weapon caches tell another story. Estonian and Curonian archaeological sites from this period are full of weapons, not just defensive arms, but offensive arsenals. Swords, spear points, arrows in quantities that suggest these societies were permanently militarized. More telling, many of these weapons are Scandinavian in design, either captured or copied. This wasn't empty sea dotted with helpless fishing villages. This was a militarized maritime zone where multiple naval powers competed for dominance. The Vikings were entering waters where other sharks already swam. Two maritime cultures collide. Here's what Viking Age popular history usually gets wrong. When Scandinavian Vikings expanded eastward into the Baltic, they weren't conquering helpless farmers. They were entering into competition with societies that were, in many ways, mirror images of themselves. The Estonians and Curonians were ship cultures. Their entire economic and social systems, just like the Vikings, revolved around the sea. Estonian and Curonian boys learned to sail before they could properly walk, just like Viking children. Their coming-of-age rituals involved sea raids, just like young Vikings. Their social status depended on ships owned and successful voyages completed, just like you get the pattern. But there were crucial differences that would define this centuries-long conflict. Viking longships were engineering marvels. We all know this. They could cross oceans, navigate rivers, and beach on almost any shore. But Estonian and Curonian vessels were adapted for different waters. Estonian ships, based on archaeological evidence and later medieval depictions, were smaller, more maneuverable, designed for archipelago warfare. They couldn't cross oceans, but they didn't need to. In the island maze of the eastern Baltic, a smaller, nimbler vessel could outmaneuver a Viking longship every time. The Curonian ships described by chroniclers like Saxo Grammaticus were different again. They were built for speed and river navigation. They could vanish up rivers where Viking keels couldn't follow, then reappear weeks later to strike at undefended coasts. Even the Danish historian Saxo Grammaticus, writing in the 12th century AD with obvious pro-Danish bias, had to admit the Curonians were exceptional sailors. He straight up calls them pirates, cori quos pirathas appellant. He describes their raids on Denmark with barely concealed admiration for their seamanship. The cultural parallels run deeper. Both societies practiced similar forms of warrior religion. The Estonians and Curonians had their own war gods that paralleled Odin and Thor. Both cultures practiced ship burials for their elite warriors. Both saw raiding as not just economically necessary, but spiritually meaningful. Young men earned their names through violence and voyaging. But the defenders had one massive advantage. They were defending. When Vikings raided Estonia or Curonia, locals could disappear into forests, marshes, and interior strongholds, then counterattack when Vikings were vulnerable, loading plunder, repairing ships, or camping on beaches. When Estonians and Curonians raided Scandinavia, they were using the Vikings' own tactics against them, but with superior local knowledge of their home waters for the escape. The timeline of this conflict spans nearly 400 years. From the first recorded Viking expeditions into the eastern Baltic in the 8th century AD to the final conquest of Estonia by German and Danish crusaders in 1227 AD, these maritime cultures were locked in a cycle of raid and counter-raid, conquest and rebellion, cultural exchange and bitter warfare. What emerges from the archaeological and chronicle evidence isn't a story of Viking expansion checked by primitive tribes. It's a story of two equally sophisticated maritime cultures competing for the same ecological niche, sea-based raiding and trading economy. The Vikings had first mover advantage in some technologies and tactics, but the Balts had home field advantage and proved remarkably quick learners. The stakes of the game. To understand why Estonians, Curonians, and Vikings fought so bitterly for so long, you need to understand what they were fighting for. This wasn't about abstract concepts like honour or glory, though those mattered. This was about controlling trade routes worth more than kingdoms. The eastern, Baltic controlled access to one of medieval Europe's most valuable trade networks. From the Baltic, you could reach the fur territories of Finland and Russia. Those furs, sable, ermine, beaver, were the medieval equivalent of oil. European nobility couldn't get enough of them. A single winter's successful fur trading could set a man up for life. Then there was amber, the Baltic's unique treasure. The Curonians controlled significant amber beaches. This fossilized resin was worth its weight in silver in medieval markets, sometimes more. Amber roots had existed since Roman times, and whoever controlled the source controlled immense wealth. Vikings wanted that control. Curonians had no intention of giving it up. But the real prize was the river routes. The Daugava River, flowing through Curonian territory, was a highway to the east. Follow it upstream, make a few portages, and you could reach the Dnieper and sail all the way to Constantinople. The Volga route, accessible through Finnish and Estonian territories, led to the Caspian Sea and the Islamic world. These weren't just trade routes, they were licenses to print money. The Gulf of Finland, controlled largely by Estonians, was the gateway to Novgorod, one of Europe's richest cities. Novgorod's fur markets, silver flows, and connections to the Silk Road made it incredibly valuable. Every ship that wanted to trade with Novgorod had to pass through waters that Estonians could control. That's power. Gotland sits in the middle of the Baltic like a merchant's dream. This Swedish island was fabulously wealthy from trade, but also fantastically vulnerable. Gotland changed hands or paid protection money to avoid changing hands multiple times. Estonian fleets threatened it regularly. Curonian raiders treated it as a recurring source of plunder. For Gotland's merchants, the question wasn't whether they'd be raided, but by whom and how often. The religious dimension added another layer of complexity. As Scandinavia gradually Christianized from the 10th century AD onward, Baltic paganism became both a point of resistance and an excuse for conquest. Christian Vikings could claim religious justification for raids on pagan Estonians. Pagan Estonians could present their raids as strikes against Christian oppression. But don't imagine unified nations fighting each other. The political reality was far messier. Multiple Estonian tribes, Oselians, Revelians, Virumaa, Sakala, and others, sometimes cooperated, sometimes fought each other. The Curonians were divided among several power centres. Sweden, Denmark, and Norway were often at each other's throats, even while fighting Balts. This political fragmentation meant the conflict was never a simple us versus them scenario. Today's ally could be tomorrow's target. The economic model both sides followed was essentially the same. Raid and trade were two aspects of the same activity. A Viking merchant ship could become a raiding vessel the moment it spotted a weaker target. An Estonian trading expedition could pivot to piracy if the opportunity arose. The same harbours that welcomed peaceful traders in spring might dispatch raiders in autumn. This dual economy meant peace was always temporary, war always economic. Consider the scale of wealth involved. When Estonians burned Sigtuna in 1187 AD, they didn't just grab some coins and run. They systematically looted one of Scandinavia's richest cities. The amount of silver, trade goods, and ecclesiastical treasures they carried home would have funded years of shipbuilding and warrior training. Similarly, when Vikings extracted tribute from Estonian tribes, they weren't taking token payments. They were demanding enough wealth to fund expeditions and maintain warrior retinues. The slave trade added another brutal dimension. Both Vikings and Balts took captives for sale in eastern markets. A successful raid could capture hundreds of people, each worth significant silver in Novgorod, Kiev, or Constantinople. The human cost of this maritime competition was enormous. Entire coastal communities could disappear overnight, their populations scattered across slave markets from Ireland to the Caspian. The long game here was about more than individual raids, or even control of specific routes. This was about which culture would dominate Baltic maritime space. Would the Baltic become a Scandinavian lake, with Vikings extracting tribute from cowering coastal peoples, or would it remain contested water, where Estonian and Curonian fleets could challenge any Viking expansion? For nearly 4 centuries, the answer was contested. The Vikings, despite their reputation, despite their technological advantages, despite their connections to broader European political and economic networks, could not subdue the Eastern Baltic's maritime peoples. The Estonians and Curonians didn't just resist, they fought back with equal aggression, equal skill, and sometimes greater success. The stage was set for one of medieval Europe's longest, most complex naval conflicts. 2 maritime cultures, mirror images in many ways, locked in a struggle for the same ecological and economic niche. Neither side could deliver a knockout blow. Both sides could inflict terrible damage. The Baltic Sea became a battlefield where Viking expansion met its match, where the raiders became the raided, where the hunters became hunted. The burning of Sigtuna wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of centuries of escalating maritime warfare, a dramatic reversal that showed the Vikings they were not the only wolves on these waters. And we're just getting started, because before Sigtuna burned, before Estonian fleets could strike deep into Swedish territory, the Vikings did have their moment of advantage. They came to the eastern Baltic with superior ships, better weapons, and the confidence of conquerors. How that advantage crumbled, how the Balts learned and adapted, how the hunters became the hunted, that's where our story really begins. Part 2, Round 1, Viking Advantages, the initial push east. The Viking expansion into the Baltic didn't begin with massive invasion fleets. It started with exploratory probes, trading ventures that gradually morphed into something more aggressive. The 8th and 9th centuries AD saw Swedish Vikings, particularly those from the regions around Lake Mälaren and Gotland, systematically exploring eastward. The archaeological evidence at Grobin, in modern Latvia, tells us the Vikings weren't just raiding, they were settling. The site reveals 2 distinct cemeteries from the Viking Age, one showing Gotlandic burial customs, another showing central Swedish traditions. These weren't temporary camps. These were communities, complete with workshops, trading posts, and defensive structures. The Vikings were putting down roots in Curonian territory. But Grobin was just one node in an expanding network. Swedish Vikings established themselves at key points along the eastern Baltic coast. They built fortified trading posts that could serve dual purposes: peaceful commerce when possible, defensive strongholds when necessary. Each successful establishment became a jumping-off point for the next push eastward. The Rus movement, through Finnish and Estonian territories, represents one of history's most audacious expansions. Swedish Vikings didn't just sail along coasts. They penetrated deep into continental river systems. They portaged their ships across watersheds. They established control points at strategic river junctions. Within a few generations, Swedish Vikings calling themselves Rus had reached the Black Sea and the Caspian. The initial Estonian response wasn't unified resistance. It couldn't be. Estonia, in the 9th century AD, wasn't a nation, but a collection of tribal territories, each with its own concerns and conflicts. Some Estonian chiefs saw opportunities in these strange northerners. They could trade furs for iron. They could acquire new weapons. They could even hire Viking mercenaries for their own local conflicts. The sagas, while written much later and prone to exaggeration, preserve echoes of these early interactions. They speak of Swedish kings claiming overlordship of Estonian territories, of tribute payments, of Estonian auxiliaries serving in Viking forces. The Ynglinga saga mentions Swedish King Ingvar's expedition to Estonia, where he died and was buried. Whether the details are accurate or not, the pattern is clear. Vikings were deeply engaged in Estonian affairs from early on. Danish Vikings took a different approach, focusing on the southern Baltic shores. They established strongholds along what's now the German and Polish coasts, gradually working their way eastward toward Curonian territories. The Danish approach was more systematically military. Where Swedish Vikings often began as traders who became raiders, Danish expeditions frequently started as raids. The deceptive quiet of the late 8th and early 9th centuries AD shouldn't fool us. While Estonian and Curonian societies weren't immediately mobilizing massive resistance, they were watching. They were learning. Every Viking raid taught them about Scandinavian tactics. Every traded sword showed them new metallurgy. Every captured ship revealed construction techniques. Archaeological evidence from Estonian coastal settlements shows a gradual shift in this period. Weapons become more common in burials. Fortifications become more sophisticated. Harbour defences appear where none existed before. The material culture shows increasing Scandinavian influence, but not in the way of conquered peoples adopting conquerors' styles. This looks more like selective adoption, conscious choices about what to take and what to leave. The Viking advantage in this early period was real, but not overwhelming. They had momentum. They had connections to broader trade networks. They had tested military tactics. But they were operating far from home, in unfamiliar territory, among peoples who were anything but passive victims. The seeds of future Baltic resistance were already being planted in these first encounters. Viking tactical advantages. The Vikings didn't dominate early encounters through superior courage or ferocity. Every Baltic warrior culture had brave fighters. The Viking advantages were more systematic, more technological, more organizational. Start with the ships. A 9th century AD Viking longship was a masterpiece of engineering that Baltic peoples had nothing to match, initially. The combination of sail and oars gave Vikings strategic mobility that was almost magical. They could ride winds when favourable, row when not. They could navigate open ocean, follow coasts, or penetrate rivers. The shallow draft meant they could appear almost anywhere there was water. Viking ships were also bigger than most Baltic vessels of the early period. A typical Viking warship could carry 30 to 60 warriors, sometimes more. Estonian and Curonian boats, based on archaeological evidence, were generally smaller, carrying maybe 10 to 20 men. This meant Vikings could achieve local superiority, even when overall numbers were equal. They could concentrate force at chosen points. The organizational advantages went beyond ship size. Vikings had developed sophisticated systems for mobilizing expeditions. The Ledang system could summon ships and crews from across a kingdom. A Swedish or Danish king could assemble fleets of dozens, even hundreds of vessels for major campaigns. Estonian and Karelian chiefs, ruling smaller territories with less centralized authority, struggled to match such concentrations. Weapons technology gave Vikings another edge. Scandinavian smiths had perfected pattern, welded Damascus steel swords that were superior to anything produced in the eastern Baltic. These blades were flexible enough not to shatter, hard enough to hold an edge, perfectly balanced for ship combat. Viking swords from this period were so valued that they became prestige items across Europe. Viking armour, particularly chain mail, provided protection that most Baltic warriors couldn't match. A wealthy Viking warrior in mail could wade through opponents wearing leather or textile armour. The psychological impact of facing iron-clad warriors who seemed immune to normal weapons shouldn't be underestimated. But perhaps the most significant Viking advantage was their network. By the 9th century AD, Vikings were operating from Ireland to Russia, from Greenland to the Mediterranean. This gave them access to information, technologies, and tactics from across the known world. They could hire Frankish swordsmiths, learn Arab navigation techniques, adopt Slavic rivercraft designs. They were cosmopolitan in a way that initially isolated Baltic peoples couldn't match. The psychological dimension mattered too. Vikings had developed a reputation that preceded them. The mere sight of dragon-headed longships could cause panic. Communities might pay tribute rather than fight, assuming resistance was futile. This reputation was carefully cultivated. Vikings understood that fear was a weapon as powerful as any sword. Viking political sophistication also played a role. They understood alliance building, hostage taking, and divide and conquer tactics. They could exploit tensions between Estonian tribes, play Curonians against Prussians, offer protection to some while threatening others. They brought a level of strategic thinking that went beyond simple raiding. The network effects compounded every other advantage. Viking success attracted more Vikings. Young warriors from across Scandinavia joined profitable expeditions. Successful raiders reinvested plunder in better ships and weapons. The Viking expansion became self-reinforcing, a feedback loop of increasing power. Early Estonian and Curonian setbacks. The price of learning to fight Vikings was paid in blood and silver. Estonian and Karelian peoples suffered significant defeats and humiliations before they developed effective counters to Viking tactics. The tribute payments recorded in sagas and confirmed by archaeology tell a story of subjugation. Estonian tribes paid protection money to Swedish kings. The amounts weren't token. Archaeology shows significant flows of Baltic wealth westward in the 9th and early 10th centuries AD. Silver, furs, amber, and slaves moved from Estonian and Curonian territories to Scandinavia. Some coastal settlements were lost entirely. The Grobin settlement in Curonian territory persisted for over a century, a Swedish and Gotlandic foothold on the eastern Baltic shore. Archaeological evidence shows Scandinavian-style buildings, Scandinavian grave goods, Scandinavian daily objects. This wasn't temporary occupation. This was colonization. Danish fort construction attempts along the southern Baltic represented another form of control. While not all these forts survived local resistance, their construction showed Danish ambitions to establish permanent military presence. Each fort was a statement of dominance, a claim to territory, a base for further expansion. The cemetery evidence from Grobin is particularly telling. Mixed among Scandinavian burials are local Baltic graves, but these show signs of cultural adaptation. Baltic warriors buried with Scandinavian weapons, Baltic women with Scandinavian jewellery. This could represent peaceful interaction, but in the context of tribute payments and military occupation, it more likely shows the pressure to accommodate conquerors. Internal divisions among Baltic peoples made resistance harder. Estonian tribes fought each other as often as they fought Vikings. Curonians competed with Prussians and Lithuanians. Vikings exploited these divisions expertly, supporting one faction against another, ensuring no unified resistance could emerge. The learning curve was steep and painful. Early Estonian attempts to match Viking tactics often failed catastrophically. Trying to fight Vikings in open water with inferior ships was suicidal. Attempting to match them in conventional battlefield combat meant facing superior armour and weapons. The archaeological record from this period shows battlefield defeat sites, mass graves, burned settlements. The technological gap had to be closed through capture and copying. Every Viking sword taken in combat was studied, its construction analysed. Captured Vikings, when not sold as slaves, might be forced to reveal shipbuilding techniques, but this knowledge transfer took time. Meanwhile, Vikings continued to innovate, staying ahead of Baltic attempts to catch up. The economic disruption was severe. Constant raiding and tribute demands disrupted normal Baltic trade patterns. Resources that might have gone to development went instead to paying off Vikings or rebuilding after raids. The psychological burden of living under constant threat affected entire societies. Yet, even in defeat, Baltic peoples were adapting. The hill forts that appeared across Estonia in this period weren't just defensive structures. They were rallying points, symbols of resistance, centres for organising counterstrikes. The weapon deposits, found in Estonian bogs and waters from this period, suggest ritual activities, perhaps calling on supernatural aid against invaders. The saga references to Estonian wizardry and Curonian sorcery might reflect Viking unease at Baltic spiritual resistance. When military resistance failed, Baltic peoples turned to other forms of opposition. Bad weather that wrecked Viking fleets was attributed to Estonian magic. Diseases that struck Viking camps were blamed on Curonian curses. Whether or not Baltic peoples actually practiced such magic, Vikings believed they did, and that belief mattered. By the late 10th century AD, the period of easy Viking victories was ending. Estonian and Karelian societies had paid the price of education in Viking warfare. They had suffered defeats, lost territories, paid tribute, but they had also learned. They had acquired technologies. They had developed counters. The stage was set for a reversal that would shock Scandinavian societies. The students were about to become the teachers. The raiders were about to become the raided. The Baltic peoples, who had suffered under Viking expansion, were preparing to demonstrate that they had learned their lessons all too well. The transformation wouldn't happen overnight. It would take generations of development, innovation, and careful preparation. But when Estonian and Curonian fleets finally took the offensive, when they brought fire and sword to Scandinavian shores, they would do so with tactics and technologies that Vikings themselves had taught them. The hunters were training the hunters who would hunt them. The Vikings just didn't know it yet. Part 3. The Counter. Baltic Innovations. The Estonian Naval Revolution. The transformation of Estonian naval power didn't happen through some sudden technological breakthrough. It was evolution under pressure, adaptation driven by survival necessity, innovation born from careful observation of the enemy. By the 11th century AD, Estonian ships were no longer inferior copies of Viking vessels. They were something new, something specifically designed for Baltic warfare. The Salme ship burials, discovered on Saaremaa, completely changed our understanding of early Estonian naval capabilities. These aren't crude fishing boats pressed into military service. These are purpose-built warships, and they date from the 8th century AD, earlier than many assumed Estonian naval power developed. The ships contained warriors buried with their weapons, including swords of Scandinavian type, but also uniquely Baltic designs. But here's what makes the Salme ships remarkable. They show Estonian naval technology diverging from Viking models, even while incorporating Viking influences. The construction techniques are different. The proportions are adapted for different purposes. These ships were built by people who understood Viking vessels, but chose to build something else. Estonian ships evolved to be lighter and faster than Viking longships. Where Vikings built for ocean crossings and river navigation, Estonians optimized for archipelago warfare. Their vessels could thread through island chains, where deeper drafted Viking ships feared to go. They could hide in shallow bays invisible from open water. They could strike and disappear before Viking forces could respond. The archaeological evidence from Saaremaa harbours shows sophisticated infrastructure. These weren't natural anchorages with a few boats pulled up on beaches. These were engineered naval bases with constructed breakwaters, maintained channels, and fortified storage facilities. The investment in infrastructure suggests permanent naval establishments, not seasonal raiding camps. Estonian navigation mastery went beyond knowing local waters. They developed a system for operating in conditions that immobilized Viking fleets. Estonian pilots could navigate in fog using sound, smell, and current patterns. They knew which channels stayed ice-free, latest in winter, earliest in spring. They mapped every seasonal wind pattern, every tidal flow, every navigable passage. The ice navigation capabilities deserve special attention. Estonians didn't see winter as the end of naval operations. They saw it as opportunity. When the Baltic froze, Estonian raiders could move across ice, where Viking ships sat trapped in harbours. They developed specialised ice boats, vessels that could be dragged across frozen surfaces then launched in open leads. Winter, traditionally the safe season, became the terror season for Scandinavian coastal communities. Tactical innovation followed technological development. Estonians perfected the night raid, using darkness and local knowledge to appear without warning. They developed coordinated attack patterns, multiple small squadrons striking simultaneously at different points, overwhelming Viking defensive responses. They learned to use weather as a weapon, attacking when conditions favoured their lighter vessels. Saaremaa emerged as an impregnable naval fortress. The island's position allowed Estonian fleets to threaten any Baltic transit while remaining almost impossible to attack. Viking expeditions against Saaremaa repeatedly failed. The harbours were too well defended. The approach channels were too dangerous for unfamiliar navigators. The population could mobilise quickly to repel invaders. The communication systems Estonians developed were remarkably sophisticated. Signal fires on elevated positions could transmit messages across the archipelago in hours. A Viking fleet spotted off one island would be known throughout Estonian waters before sunset. This early warning system meant Estonian forces could concentrate against threats or disperse to avoid superior forces. Archaeological evidence of weapon production shows Estonians weren't just copying Viking designs anymore, they were innovating. Estonian spear points from the 11th century AD show unique features adapted for naval combat. Estonian axes balanced differently than Viking models, optimized for shipboard fighting in confined spaces. Even Estonian shields evolved specific characteristics, lighter and more maneuverable than Viking versions. The rapid mobilization capability Estonians developed was perhaps their greatest innovation. Unlike Viking Lidang systems that might take weeks to assemble large fleets, Estonian forces could concentrate in days. Every coastal settlement maintained ready vessels. Every able-bodied man knew his station. When the signal fires burned, the response was instant. By the early 12th century AD, Estonian naval forces weren't just defending anymore, they were taking the offensive. Estonian fleets appeared in Swedish waters with the same suddenness that Viking raiders had once brought to Estonian shores. The naval revolution was complete. The defenders had become the attackers. Curonian piracy perfected. If Estonians revolutionized Baltic naval warfare through innovation, Curonians perfected it through pure predatory efficiency. Medieval chroniclers didn't call them pirates as an insult. They called them pirates because that's what Curonians excelled at, professional maritime predation that made even Vikings nervous. The Curonian Spit, that narrow peninsula separating the Curonian lagoon from the Baltic Sea, was nature's perfect pirate base. Ships could lurk in the lagoon, invisible from the sea. When prey passed, Curonian vessels could surge through the straits, strike, and retreat before pursuit could organize. The geography created a ship trap. that Curonians exploited ruthlessly. Saxo Grammaticus, writing his Danish history in the late 12th century AD, couldn't hide his frustrated admiration for Curonian maritime skills. He describes their raids on Denmark with detail that suggests painful familiarity. Danish coastal towns burned, Danish ships vanished. Danish punitive expeditions found empty seas and abandoned villages. The Curonians had perfected strategic withdrawal and opportunistic return. Swedish chronicles from the same period echo similar complaints. Curonian raiders struck Gotland repeatedly. They appeared off Swedish coasts when least expected. They took ships, cargo, and people with impunity. The Swedish crown's inability to stop Curonian piracy became a recurring political embarrassment. The ship capture and reverse engineering program Curonians developed was remarkably systematic. They didn't just steal Viking vessels, they studied them. Captured shipbuilders were forced to teach construction techniques. Captured navigators revealed route knowledge. Every taken ship added to Curonian technical knowledge. Archaeological evidence from Curonian territories shows a fascinating progression in ship construction techniques. Early vessels are clearly Baltic in design. Middle-period ships show increasing Scandinavian influence. But late-period vessels, from the 11th and 12th centuries AD, show hybrid designs. Curonians were taking the best of both traditions, creating something unique. The slave trade reversal was particularly galling to Scandinavian pride. Vikings had built wealth selling Baltic slaves in eastern markets. Now Curonians were capturing Vikings and selling them down the same routes. Swedish and Danish captives ended up in Novgorod, Kiev, even Constantinople. The hunters had become the hunted in the most literal sense. Coordination with Prussians and Lithuanians gave Curonians strategic depth. When Viking retaliation forces arrived, Curonian raiders could disappear into Lithuanian forests or Prussian marshlands. These alliances, fluid and opportunistic, meant Vikings faced not isolated tribal groups, but coordinated resistance networks. The psychological warfare Curonians waged was as effective as their physical raids. They cultivated a reputation for mercilessness that made Viking sailors genuinely afraid. Stories spread of Curonian atrocities, probably exaggerated but psychologically devastating. Viking merchants began avoiding certain routes entirely, rather than risk Curonian attention. Curonian tactics emphasized mobility and surprise over direct confrontation. They rarely fought major naval battles. Instead, they picked off isolated ships, struck undefended settlements, disappeared when challenged by superior forces. This guerrilla naval warfare frustrated Viking attempts at decisive engagement. The economic model Curonians developed was piracy as a sustainable industry. They didn't just raid sporadically, they maintained constant pressure on Baltic trade routes. They extracted protection payments from merchants. They sold safe passage guarantees. They turned the Baltic into a toll road where they collected the fees. The river expertise Curonians possessed gave them another advantage. They could navigate the Daugava, Nemunas, and Vistula river systems better than any Viking. When pursued at sea, they vanished up rivers where Viking ships couldn't follow. When Vikings guarded coasts, Curonians struck inland via waterways. By the mid-12th century AD, Curonian piracy had become such a problem that it drove political realignments. Denmark and Sweden, often enemies, found common cause against Curonian raiders. The Holy Roman Empire became involved, seeing Curonian piracy as a threat to German Baltic trade. The Curonians had made too many enemies, but for over a century they had terrorized the Baltic with impunity. The Intelligence War. The Baltic people's greatest strategic advantage over Vikings might have been invisible, superior intelligence gathering. While Vikings relied on force and reputation, Estonians and Curonians built information networks that gave them crucial advantages in planning and executing operations. Language capabilities created an asymmetric intelligence advantage. Baltic peoples learned Norse languages out of necessity. Estonian and Curonian merchants, hostages, and slaves in Scandinavian territories absorbed not just vocabulary but cultural knowledge. They understood Viking social structures, political tensions, and economic vulnerabilities. Meanwhile, Vikings rarely bothered learning Baltic languages. They saw no need. This linguistic arrogance meant Baltic peoples could communicate openly even in Viking presence. Estonian merchants could discuss Viking weaknesses while trading in Gotland markets. Curonian sailors could coordinate attacks while serving on Viking ships. The trade espionage network Baltic peoples developed was remarkably sophisticated. Every Estonian merchant visiting Gotland was a potential spy. Every Curonian trader in Danish markets gathered intelligence. They noted fortification weaknesses, traced wealth concentrations, identified political disputes. This economic intelligence was systematically collected and shared. Marriage alliances created deeper intelligence penetration. Baltic nobles married into Viking families, gaining access to insider information. These mixed marriages weren't just political arrangements. They were intelligence operations. Baltic wives in Viking halls heard plans, observed preparations, understood vulnerabilities. This information flowed back to Estonian and Curonian leadership. The seasonal patterns intelligence was particularly valuable. Baltic observers learned Viking raiding schedules, when fleets departed, when they returned, when defences were weakest. They knew when Norwegian Vikings would be in Ireland, when Danish forces would be in England, when Swedish Vikings would be travelling eastern rivers. This knowledge allowed perfectly timed counterstrikes. Economic intelligence gathering focused on identifying wealth concentrations worth targeting. Baltic spies noted which churches had gold, which towns had full treasuries, which merchant ships carried valuable cargo. The precision of later Estonian and Curonian raids suggests excellent advance intelligence. They knew exactly what they were looking for and where to find it. Political intelligence allowed Baltic peoples to exploit Viking internal conflicts. When Danish and Swedish kings fought, Estonian raids increased. When Norwegian succession disputes erupted, Curonian pirates grew bolder. Baltic peoples understood that divided enemies were vulnerable enemies. They timed their operations to exploit Scandinavian disunity. The hostage system, meant to ensure Baltic compliance, became an intelligence goldmine. Sons of Estonian and Curonian chiefs, held in Scandinavian courts, weren't just prisoners. They were observers. They learned Viking military tactics, studied fortification designs, understood political dynamics. When they eventually returned home, they brought invaluable knowledge. Counterintelligence was equally important. Baltic peoples learned to feed false information to Viking spies. They manipulated Viking perceptions, appearing weaker than they were, hiding preparations, misdirecting attention. Archaeological evidence of deliberately destroyed fortifications might represent efforts to deceive Viking scouts about defensive capabilities. The communication systems supporting this intelligence network were remarkably robust. Information moved through merchant routes, religious pilgrimages, or seasonal migrations. A piece of intelligence gathered in Denmark could reach Estonian commanders within weeks. This information velocity allowed rapid tactical adaptation. Technical intelligence gathering focused on military innovations. Every captured Viking weapon was studied. Every observed tactic was analysed. Every new technology was evaluated for adoption or counter-development. The archaeological record shows Baltic weapons becoming increasingly sophisticated, incorporating and improving on Viking designs. The cumulative effect of superior intelligence was strategic advantage despite tactical parity. Baltic forces could choose when and where to fight. They could avoid unfavorable engagements. They could concentrate against weakness. They could exploit opportunities. Intelligence multiplied the effective strength of Baltic naval forces. By the 12th century AD, the intelligence war had shifted decisively in Baltic favour. Estonian and Curonian leaders knew more about Scandinavian kingdoms than Viking kings knew about Baltic territories. This knowledge imbalance translated directly into military advantage. When Estonian fleets burned Sigtuna in 1187 AD, they knew exactly where to strike for maximum impact. The intelligence war demonstrates a crucial truth about the Viking-Baltic conflict. Military technology and tactical skill were important, but information superiority might have been decisive. The Vikings, accustomed to overwhelming less organized opponents, found themselves facing enemies who knew them better than they knew themselves. This intelligence advantage helps explain why Viking expansion stalled in the eastern Baltic. It wasn't just military resistance. It was the frustration of facing opponents who anticipated moves, exploited weaknesses, and turned Viking tactics against them. The Baltic peoples had studied their enemies carefully, and the education was complete. Part 4. The Stalemate, Mutual Raiding Era. The Great Raids begin. The 11th century AD marked a fundamental shift in Baltic maritime warfare. Estonian and Curonian forces stopped playing defense. They went on the attack, bringing the same terror to Scandinavian shores that Vikings had inflicted on them for generations. The transformation was so complete that Scandinavian chronicles began describing these Baltic peoples with the same fearful language once reserved for Viking raiders themselves. The Estonian offensive capability that emerged in the 1000s AD was shocking in its sophistication. These weren't desperate retaliatory strikes by scattered tribes. These were coordinated naval campaigns that penetrated deep into Scandinavian territory. Estonian fleets appeared off Danish coasts with dozens of ships, hundreds of warriors, and clear strategic objectives. Archaeological evidence from Danish coastal sites shows distinct destruction layers dating to this period. Burned churches, destroyed settlements, mass burial sites all tell the story of successful Estonian raids. The distribution of these sites isn't random. They cluster around wealthy trading centres and political strongholds, suggesting Estonian intelligence identified high-value targets. Swedish villages along the eastern coast lived in constant fear. The archaeological record shows a dramatic shift in settlement patterns during the 11th and 12th centuries AD. Coastal communities moved inland. New settlements were built on defensible positions rather than convenient harbours. Churches were fortified. The very landscape of eastern Sweden was reshaped by Estonian threat. The Gotland campaigns became a recurring nightmare for the island's wealthy merchants. Estonian fleets struck Gotland at least 17 times between 1050 AD and 1200 AD, according to fragmentary records. Sometimes they demanded tribute, sometimes they simply plundered. The island's exposed position made defence nearly impossible. Gotland's merchants found themselves paying protection money to Estonian chiefs just as Estonian tribes had once paid Vikings. Finnish and Estonian cooperation added another dimension to Baltic offensive capabilities. While linguistic and cultural differences existed, shared antipathy towards Swedish expansion created alliance opportunities. Combined Finnish-Estonian fleets could strike from multiple directions simultaneously, overwhelming Swedish defensive responses. The Curonian deep strikes into Scandinavian territory demonstrated remarkable operational reach. Curonian raiders weren't content with hitting coastal targets. They penetrated river systems, struck inland towns, and escaped before meaningful pursuit could organize. The speed and audacity of these raids suggests careful planning and excellent intelligence. What made this mutual raiding era particularly devastating was its cyclical nature. A Swedish raid on Estonia would trigger Estonian retaliation on Sweden. Danish attacks on Caronia would prompt Curonian strikes on Denmark. Each successful raid demanded vengeance, creating escalating cycles of violence that neither side could break. The scale of these operations challenges traditional narratives about Baltic peoples being primitive compared to Vikings. Moving hundreds of warriors across open sea, coordinating multiple ship squadrons, maintaining logistics for extended campaigns, these required organizational capabilities equal to anything Vikings demonstrated. The Baltic peoples had learned their lessons well. Seasonal patterns emerged in this mutual raiding. Spring saw the first movements as ice cleared. Summer brought major campaigns when weather was most favorable. Autumn raids targeted harvest wealth. Winter didn't end operations, but changed them, with ice raids becoming a distinctly Baltic innovation that Vikings struggled to counter. The psychological impact on Scandinavian societies was profound. Vikings had built their identity on being raiders, not the raided. Having Estonian and Curonian fleets appear in their waters, burning their towns, taking their people, shattered Viking self-perception. Saga literature from this period shows increasing anxiety about Baltic threats. Neither side could achieve decisive victory because both had developed effective counters to the other's tactics. Vikings couldn't successfully invade Estonian islands or Curonian river territories. Estonians and Karelians couldn't hold Scandinavian territory against concentrated counterattacks. The result was strategic stalemate, expressed through constant tactical violence. Notable battles and campaigns. The Battle of Broviken, fought sometime in the 1150s AD, exemplifies the new Baltic naval capabilities. Swedish sources describe a major Estonian fleet intercepting Swedish ships in waters the Swedes considered their own. The battle's outcome was Estonian victory so complete that Swedish chroniclers could barely bring themselves to describe it. Archaeological evidence from the area shows weapon deposits consistent with a major naval engagement. The repeated failures to capture Saaremaa fortresses demonstrated the futility of Viking attempts at conquest. Danish King Valdemar I launched at least 3 major expeditions against the island between 1170 AD and 1180 AD. Each failed catastrophically. The approaches to Saaremaa were defended by hidden fortifications, underwater obstacles, and Estonian ships that knew every channel and current. The Danish crusade disasters of the 1170s and 1190s AD weren't just military defeats, they were strategic humiliations. Denmark mobilized resources for holy war against pagan Estonians, invoking God's blessing and papal support. The campaigns ended with Danish fleets destroyed, armies scattered, and Estonian raiders following retreating Danes back to their own shores. The Great Estonian Raid of 1187 AD on Sigtuna remains the most dramatic reversal of the entire conflict. The coordination required was extraordinary. Estonian and Karelian fleets had to navigate through the Stockholm archipelago, past multiple Swedish defensive positions, into Lake Mälaren itself. The complete destruction of Sweden's premier city demonstrated Estonian ability to strike anywhere, anytime. Archaeological evidence from Sigtuna is striking. The destruction layer from 1187 AD shows intense burning across the entire settlement. Stone churches that should have survived normal fires were somehow destroyed, suggesting Estonians had developed specific techniques for maximizing destruction. Coin hoards buried during the attack and never recovered indicate the population had little warning. Curonian capture of Viking trade ships became so routine that it reshaped Baltic commerce. Merchant vessels travelled in convoys for protection. Insurance systems developed to spread risk of Curonian piracy. Some merchants gave up Baltic trade entirely, rather than face Curonian predation. The economic impact rippled across Scandinavia. The ice campaigns represent a unique Baltic innovation in medieval warfare. When the Baltic froze, Estonian and Curonian forces could move across ice with specialized equipment. They struck Swedish coastal settlements in depths of winter, when defenders least expected attack. Vikings, unfamiliar with ice warfare, had no effective counter-tactics. Archaeological evidence from weapon deposits shows the intensity of this period's fighting. Mass deposits of weapons in lakes and bogs, probably ritual offerings after battles, appear across the Baltic region. The quantity and quality of weapons suggests major engagements involving hundreds, possibly thousands of warriors. These weren't minor skirmishes, but full-scale battles. The Battle of Åland in 1170 AD saw a combined Danish-Norwegian fleet ambushed by Estonian forces. The Scandinavians had superior numbers and ships, but Estonians had superior position and tactics. Using shallow water channels where Viking ships couldn't maneuver effectively, Estonian forces inflicted severe casualties before disappearing into their archipelago. The Sankt Hans Day massacre of 1206 AD demonstrated Curonian tactical sophistication. Curonian forces pretended to retreat before a Swedish punitive expedition, drawing pursuers into a pre-planned kill zone. The Swedish force was annihilated almost to the last man. The psychological impact was devastating. Swedish forces became reluctant to pursue Curonian raiders even after successful defense. Burnt layers in archaeological sites across the Baltic region show the widespread nature of mutual raiding. These aren't concentrated in border regions, but spread throughout Scandinavian and Baltic territories. The entire Baltic had become a war zone where no coastal settlement was truly safe. Ship grave evidence from this period shows technological convergence. Estonian ship burials contain Scandinavian-style weapons. Viking burials include Baltic design elements. Both cultures were learning from each other, adopting successful innovations, creating hybrid approaches to naval warfare. The mutual raiding had produced mutual education, economic warfare. The economic dimension of Baltic Viking conflict went far beyond simple plunder. Both sides developed sophisticated strategies for economic disruption that would be familiar to modern strategic planners. Trade route control, market manipulation, and systematic wealth extraction became weapons as important as swords and ships. Trade route disruption was the simplest and most effective form of economic warfare. Estonian control of the Gulf of Finland meant they could choke Swedish and Finnish trade with Novgorod at will. When diplomatic relations soured, Estonian pirates would increase activity, driving up transport costs until trade became unprofitable. Swedish merchants faced the choice of paying Estonian protection money or finding alternative routes. The protection racket reversal was particularly galling to Viking pride. Where Vikings had once extracted tribute from Baltic peoples, now Swedish and Danish merchants paid regular fees to Estonian and Curonian chiefs for safe passage. These weren't voluntary payments. Merchants who refused found their ships seized, crews enslaved, cargo confiscated. The amber monopoly battles had strategic implications beyond immediate profit. Amber was one of the few trade goods the Baltic region monopolized globally. Curonians controlled significant amber sources. Vikings wanted that control. The resulting competition drove military campaigns, diplomatic initiatives, and economic espionage. Control of amber meant reliable wealth, independent of raiding success. Slave raiding in both directions created a horrific human economy. Vikings took Estonian and Curonian captives for sale in Western European and Mediterranean markets. Estonians and Karelians sold Scandinavian captives in Russian and Byzantine markets. Entire communities could be devastated by slave raids, their populations scattered across continents. Market manipulation became increasingly sophisticated as both sides learned economic warfare. Estonian forces would target specific trade goods to create artificial scarcities. Burning Danish salt production facilities drove up salt prices across the Baltic. Destroying Swedish iron shipments affected weapon production. These targeted strikes had economic impacts far exceeding their military cost. Piracy evolved from opportunistic raiding to state policy. Estonian and Curonian leaders issued letters of marque authorizing private raiders. These weren't random pirates, but state-sanctioned naval forces operating under political authority. The line between navy and piracy blurred until they became indistinguishable. The constant warfare created a massive economic drain on all participants. Resources that might have gone to development went instead to shipbuilding, weapon production, and fortification construction. The opportunity costs were enormous. While Western Europe was building cathedrals and universities, the Baltic region was locked in an endless cycle of raid and counter-raid. Currency systems reflected the economic warfare. Coin hoards from this period show remarkable diversity. Swedish, Danish, German, English, Arabic, and Byzantine coins all circulated in the Baltic. This wasn't healthy trade diversity, but evidence of plunder economy. Coins arrived not through commerce, but through raiding, tribute, and slave sales. The insurance and risk management systems that developed were remarkably sophisticated. Gotland merchants created mutual aid societies to spread losses from raids. Danish traders developed convoy systems with cost-sharing agreements. These medieval risk management strategies show how thoroughly endemic warfare had shaped Baltic economics. Agricultural disruption added another dimension to economic warfare. Raiders deliberately struck during harvest or planting seasons. Burning grain stores created famine. Killing draft animals crippled agriculture. Taking farmers as slaves destroyed agricultural capacity for years. The economic damage from agricultural disruption often exceeded direct plunder value. The cost of constant warfare eventually became unsustainable. By the late 1100s AD, both Scandinavian and Baltic societies were exhausted. The young men who should have been producing were instead raiding or defending. The wealth that should have accumulated was instead destroyed in cycles of retaliation. The economic model of mutual raiding was consuming itself. This economic exhaustion partially explains why external forces could eventually intervene successfully. When German crusaders arrived in the late 1100s AD, they found Baltic and Scandinavian societies weakened by generations of mutual predation. The economic warfare between Vikings and Balts had created an opportunity for a third party to dominate both. Part 5. The Resolution. How it ended. The German factor. The arrival of German crusaders in the Baltic fundamentally changed a conflict that had raged for 4 centuries. What Vikings couldn't accomplish through raiding and trading, Germans would attempt through systematic conquest, backed by religious authority and new military technologies. The year 1193 AD marked the beginning of the end for independent Baltic maritime power. Pope Celestine III's call for a crusade against Baltic pagans gave Germans what Vikings never had: ideological justification for total conquest. This wasn't about tribute or trade routes anymore. This was about saving souls, or at least that's what the papal bulls claimed. The reality was more complex. German merchants wanted Baltic trade. German nobles wanted Baltic land. The Church wanted Baltic converts. All found common cause in crusade. The Teutonic Knights and the Livonian Brothers of the Sword brought military innovations that shifted the balance decisively. Stone fortifications replaced wooden strongholds. Crossbows outranged any Baltic bow. Heavy cavalry, impossible for Baltic peoples to match, dominated open battlefields. Professional military orders replaced seasonal warbands. The technological and organizational gap was wider than anything Vikings had enjoyed. Danish involvement added another layer of complexity. Denmark's King Valdemar II saw German expansion as both opportunity and threat. He joined the crusade to claim his share of Baltic territory before Germans took everything. The Danish-German cooperation, despite underlying tensions, presented Baltic peoples with an enemy coalition they couldn't match. The Livonian Crusade, from 1198 AD to 1227 AD, was systematic conquest, not raiding. Germans built permanent fortifications at strategic points. They established bishoprics to administer conquered territory. They imposed feudal structures that destroyed traditional Baltic social organizations. This was colonization, not the back-and-forth raiding that had characterized Viking-Baltic conflict. Estonian resistance was fierce but ultimately futile. The Battle of Street Matthew's Day in 1217 AD saw Estonian forces nearly defeat the Crusader coalition. They killed the Livonian master, scattered German forces, and almost reclaimed their independence. But the Crusaders regrouped, received reinforcements, and returned with overwhelming force. The window of opportunity closed forever. The technology gap proved insurmountable. Estonian and Curonian naval superiority meant nothing against stone castles built at river mouths and strategic harbours. Their hit-and-run tactics couldn't dislodge permanent fortifications. Their wooden fortresses couldn't withstand siege engines. Every tactical advantage Baltic peoples had developed against Vikings proved useless against Crusader methods. The final conquest of Estonia in 1227 AD was comprehensive. Saaremaa, the impregnable island fortress that had resisted Vikings for centuries, fell to combined Danish and German forces. The surrender terms were harsh. Estonian nobles who survived had to accept Christian baptism and feudal subordination. Estonian maritime independence, maintained for half a millennium, ended not with negotiated settlement, but complete capitulation. Curonian agreements with Crusaders showed more flexibility, but ultimately similar results. Some Curonian nobles negotiated semi-autonomous status within the new order. They retained local authority in exchange for Christian conversion and military service. But Curonian piracy, the scourge of the Baltic for centuries, was systematically suppressed. German and Danish patrols, operating from permanent bases, made traditional raiding impossible. The Crusader conquest succeeded where Viking efforts failed for several reasons. First, Crusaders came to stay, not raid. Second, they brought superior military technology and organization. Third, they had ideological unity that Vikings never achieved. Fourth, they systematically destroyed Baltic social structures rather than trying to extract tribute from them. Fifth, they had learned from centuries of Viking-Baltic conflict, avoiding mistakes their predecessors made. The irony was bitter. Baltic peoples who had successfully resisted Viking expansion for 4 centuries fell to German crusaders in 3 decades. The naval skills, tactical innovations, and intelligence networks that had stymied Vikings proved irrelevant against crusader castles and crossbows. The very success against Vikings may have left Baltic peoples unprepared for a different kind of enemy, the last stand of maritime independence. Even after formal conquest, Baltic maritime traditions didn't simply vanish. Estonian and Karelian sailors, now officially Christian subjects of German or Danish masters, found ways to maintain their seafaring heritage. The forms changed, but the substance persisted, sometimes in surprising ways. The Estonian uprising of 1343 AD, known as the St. George's Night Rebellion, showed that maritime independence dreams hadn't died. Estonian forces rose simultaneously across the territory, killing German landlords and Danish officials. For a brief moment, it seemed independence might be restored. Estonian ships again raided under their own authority, but the rebellion was crushed with brutal efficiency. The reprisals were so severe that Estonian resistance was broken for centuries. Curonian participation in Lithuanian expansion offered another path for maritime traditions. As Lithuania emerged as a regional power in the 14th century AD, Curonian naval expertise became valuable again. Curonian ships served Lithuanian Grand Dukes. Curonian pilots guided Lithuanian expeditions. The relationship was subordinate, but allowed Curonian maritime culture to survive within a new political framework. The Victual Brothers phenomenon of the late 14th century AD represented a fascinating revival of Baltic piracy. Originally hired to supply Stockholm during a siege, these maritime mercenaries quickly evolved into independent pirates. Many were Estonians and Curonians operating under loose German authority. They terrorized Baltic shipping with methods their ancestors would have recognized. For a brief period, Baltic pirates again made Scandinavian merchants tremble. The gradual integration into Christian kingdoms transformed, but didn't eliminate Baltic maritime expertise. Estonian and Karelian sailors served in Danish and Swedish navies. Their knowledge of eastern Baltic waters remained invaluable. Their shipbuilding techniques influenced Scandinavian designs. The conquerors absorbed the conquered's maritime knowledge, even while suppressing their independence. Preservation of maritime traditions, under new masters, took subtle forms. Fishing communities maintained boat-building techniques. Coastal villages preserved navigation knowledge. Folk songs remembered great raids and battles. The physical conquest couldn't erase cultural memory. Estonian and Curonian maritime heritage survived in fragments, waiting for later centuries to reassemble them. The Hanseatic League's dominance of Baltic trade created new opportunities and restrictions. Baltic sailors could prosper within Hanseatic structures, but couldn't operate independently. The free-ranging piracy and raiding that had characterized earlier centuries became impossible. Maritime activity was regulated, controlled, channeled into acceptable forms. Some Estonian and Curonian nobles found accommodation within the new order by transforming from raiders to merchants. They used their maritime knowledge for peaceful trade rather than violent plunder. The same families that had terrorized Viking coasts now sent their ships to Bergen and London with trade goods. The transformation was profitable but psychologically complex. The end of independent Baltic piracy marked a fundamental shift in Northern European maritime culture. The Baltic Sea evolved from contested water where multiple naval powers competed to controlled space dominated by German and Scandinavian authorities. The age of freelance maritime violence was over. State-controlled navies replaced tribal raiders. Yet echoes of the old ways persisted surprisingly long. As late as the 16th century AD, Estonian and Curonian sailors had reputations as particularly dangerous when crossed. Swedish and Danish naval commanders specifically recruited Baltic sailors for their expertise. The maritime traditions survived, adapted, evolved, but never entirely disappeared. Why neither side could fully win pre-Crusade? Before German crusaders changed everything, Vikings and Baltic peoples had fought to exhausted stalemate. Understanding why neither could achieve decisive victory reveals fundamental truths about pre-modern naval warfare and the limits of maritime power projection. Geographic impossibility was the prime factor. The eastern Baltic's thousands of islands, countless harbours, and complex coastlines made total control impossible. Vikings couldn't garrison every island. Estonians couldn't patrol every strait. Both sides could always find somewhere to hide, regroup, and counterattack. The geography itself prevented decisive conquest. Economic interdependence created paradoxical situations where enemies needed each other. Vikings needed Baltic amber, furs, and slaves. Balts needed Scandinavian iron, silver, and manufactured goods. Even during intense conflict, some level of trade continued. Merchants from warring peoples met in neutral markets. Economic necessity override political hostility. Military parity had developed through centuries of mutual learning. Every Viking tactical innovation was eventually countered by Baltic adaptation. Every Baltic strategy was eventually understood and neutralized by Vikings. The constant conflict had educated both sides to rough equality. Neither could maintain significant military advantage for long. Political fragmentation prevented unified conquest from either direction. Estonia was never a united kingdom, but multiple tribal territories. Sweden, Denmark, and Norway spent as much time fighting each other as fighting Balts. No single political entity had resources to completely conquer and hold the entire Baltic region. The political complexity created space for continued resistance. Cultural absorption was occurring in both directions, blurring the lines between conqueror and conquered. Vikings, who settled in Baltic territories, adopted local customs. Baltic peoples, who traded with Vikings, absorbed Scandinavian practices. Intermarriage created families with loyalties to both sides. The clear distinction between us and them was dissolving through cultural exchange. The balance of terror that emerged resembled nuclear deterrence in miniature. Both sides could inflict unacceptable damage on the other. A major Viking expedition against Estonia would trigger Estonian raids on Sweden. Curonian attacks on Denmark would prompt Danish retaliation on Curonia. The cost of major offensive operations exceeded potential gains. External pressures limited how many resources either side could commit to Baltic conflict. Vikings faced threats from Germans, English, and Slavs. Baltic peoples dealt with Russian expansion and Polish ambitions. Neither could focus exclusively on their maritime rivalry. External threats prevented either from achieving local superiority. The seasonal nature of Baltic warfare created natural breathing spaces. Winter ice limited naval operations. Spring planting and autumn harvests demanded attention. Summer raiding seasons were intense but brief. The conflict's rhythm prevented sustained pressure that might have achieved decisive results. Defensive advantages in this pre-gunpowder age were significant. Wooden fortifications, while not impregnable, were difficult to capture quickly. Defenders familiar with local terrain could make invasion extremely costly. The advantage consistently lay with defenders, making permanent conquest nearly impossible. The absence of ideological motivation limited conflict intensity. This was economic and political competition, not religious war. Neither side saw the other as existentially evil. Conflict was business, brutal but not genocidal. Without ideological fervor, driving total war, negotiated settlements and temporary accommodations were always possible. Technological limitations meant neither side could project sustained power far from home bases. Ships needed regular maintenance, warriors needed supplies, weapons required replacement. The logistics of maintaining forces far from home were overwhelming. Extended campaigns inevitably weakened, giving defenders opportunity to counterattack. The result was a self-perpetuating cycle that neither Vikings nor Balts could break. Each successful raid triggered retaliation. Each retaliation justified further raids. The conflict had developed its own momentum, independent of original causes. By the 12th century AD, Vikings and Balts were fighting because they had always fought, trapped in a strategic stalemate that only external intervention could break. That intervention came from an unexpected direction. German crusaders brought not just military force, but a different conception of conquest. Where Vikings sought tribute and Balts sought independence, Germans sought total transformation. They would succeed where Vikings failed, not through superior seamanship or warrior prowess, but through systematic colonization backed by religious authority and stone castles. The Viking-Baltic stalemate was broken not by Vikings or Balts, but by outsiders who changed the rules of the game entirely. Part 6. Impact and Legacy. How Baltic resistance changed Viking behavior. The sustained Baltic resistance fundamentally altered Viking strategic thinking and operational patterns across northern Europe. The Vikings, who had once treated the Baltic as their private lake, learned to approach these waters with caution, sometimes even fear. This psychological shift had concrete manifestations in Viking society that archaeology and written sources clearly demonstrate. The most obvious change was the shift from raid to trade in Baltic regions. By the late 11th century AD, Swedish Vikings were increasingly choosing commercial engagement over military confrontation with Estonian and Curonian powers. The risk-reward calculation had shifted. Why face Estonian naval squadrons or Curonian pirates when peaceful trade could still generate profit? The archaeological record shows increasing amounts of Baltic goods in Scandinavian sites acquired through trade rather than plunder. Fortification of Swedish coastal towns accelerated dramatically during the peak of Estonian raiding in the 12th century AD. Places like Sigtuna, Stockholm, and Kalmar developed sophisticated defensive systems specifically designed to counter Baltic naval attacks. These weren't just wooden palisades, but complex defensive networks including watchtowers, harbour chains, and rapid response systems. The investment required was enormous. Resources that might have funded expansion instead went to defence. Development of defensive alliances between previously antagonistic Scandinavian powers shows how seriously they took the Baltic threat. Denmark and Sweden, traditional enemies, found themselves cooperating against Estonian and Karelian raiders. Norwegian forces occasionally joined these coalitions. The Baltic peoples had achieved what centuries of internal Scandinavian warfare hadn't: unity among Vikings against a common enemy. Changes in ship design and tactics reflected hard-learned lessons from Baltic encounters. Late period, Viking ships show modifications specifically for Baltic operations, shallower drafts for archipelago navigation, reinforced hulls for ice conditions, more maneuverable designs for close-quarters combat among islands. The Vikings were adapting their signature technology to meet Baltic challenges. Increased militarization of Viking society was partially driven by Baltic pressure. The old model of seasonal raiding by farmer warriors became insufficient when facing year-round threats from professional Baltic pirates. Scandinavian kingdoms developed standing naval forces, permanent garrisons, and professional warrior classes. The romantic image of Viking farmer raiders was replaced by military specialization necessitated by Baltic resistance. Redirection of expansion efforts away from the Baltic toward other regions marked a strategic acknowledgement of Baltic strength. Swedish Vikings increasingly focused on Russian river routes, where they faced less organized opposition. Danish Vikings concentrated on England and Germany. Norwegian Vikings looked to the Atlantic. The path of least resistance led away from Estonian and Curonian waters. The psychological impact on Viking self-perception was profound. Sagas from the 12th and 13th centuries AD show increasing respect, even fear, of Baltic maritime powers. The confident superiority that characterized early Viking Age literature was replaced by warnings about Estonian sorcery and Curonian treachery. These weren't just literary devices, but reflections of genuine psychological trauma from Baltic defeats. Viking trading practices evolved to account for Baltic threats. Merchant expeditions travelled in larger, more heavily armed convoys. Trading posts were fortified. Diplomatic missions preceded commercial ventures. The freewheeling Viking trader who might turn raider at opportunity was replaced by cautious merchants operating within protective frameworks. The loss of invincibility myth had broader implications for Viking culture. If Estonians and Curonians could burn Swedish cities and raid Danish coasts with impunity, what did that say about Viking military superiority? The psychological foundation of Viking expansion, the belief in their inherent martial superiority, was shaken by Baltic success. Religious changes may have been accelerated by Baltic resistance. Some historians argue that Scandinavian Christianization was partly motivated by desire for crusading ideology against pagan Balts. The old gods hadn't protected Sigtuna from Estonian torches. Perhaps the Christian god would prove more effective. The cumulative effect was a Viking society transformed by its encounter with Baltic maritime powers. The Vikings, who emerged from 4 centuries of Baltic conflict, were different from those who had begun it. More defensive, more cautious, more willing to trade than raid. The Baltic peoples had not just resisted Viking expansion, they had fundamentally changed Viking culture itself. What archaeology tells us? The archaeological record provides compelling physical evidence of Baltic Viking conflict that sometimes contradicts, sometimes confirms, and always complicates the written sources. Modern excavations using advanced techniques have revealed details about this maritime competition that medieval chroniclers never recorded. The Salme ship burials on Saaremaa have revolutionized understanding of early Baltic naval capabilities. These aren't crude local vessels, but sophisticated warships from the 8th century AD containing both Scandinavian and Estonian elements. The mixed grave goods suggest complex cultural interaction from the very beginning of the Viking Age. The warriors buried here carried Scandinavian-type swords, but also distinctly Baltic weapons, indicating either mixed crews or rapid technology transfer. Weapon deposits in Baltic waters tell stories of massive naval engagements. At multiple locations, archaeologists have recovered hundreds of weapons deliberately deposited in lakes and bogs. These ritual deposits, probably offerings after major battles, show sophisticated metallurgy and diverse origins. Viking swords lie alongside Estonian spears and Curonian axes. The scale suggests battles involving hundreds, possibly thousands of warriors. Fortification evolution on both Baltic shores demonstrates the escalating nature of the conflict. Early Viking Age fortifications were simple wooden palisades. By the 12th century AD, both sides were building complex defensive systems with multiple walls, specialized harbor defenses, and sophisticated gate systems. The investment in fortification shows how seriously both sides took the mutual threat. Trade good distribution provides unexpected evidence of Baltic success. Estonian and Karelian artifacts appear in increasing numbers at Scandinavian sites through the Viking Age. Not just as trade goods, but as prestige items. Baltic amber in Swedish graves, Curonian weapons in Danish hoards, Estonian jewellery in Norwegian settlements. The flow wasn't one-directional from Viking to Baltic, but genuinely mutual. Coin hoards reveal economic warfare impacts. The composition and dating of buried treasures shows periods of intense insecurity. Major hoards cluster around known raiding peaks. The coins themselves tell stories, Arabic dirhams, mixed with English pennies and Byzantine solidi, showing how raiding redistributed wealth across the entire Baltic region. Ship technology transfer is evident in construction techniques. Excavated vessels show increasing hybridization over time. Estonian ships with Scandinavian-influenced sail arrangements. Viking ships with Baltic-style reinforcements for ice navigation. By the late Viking Age, distinguishing Viking from Baltic vessels becomes increasingly difficult. The technologies had merged through centuries of competition and copying. Settlement patterns reveal strategic responses to raiding. Coastal settlements in both Scandinavia and Baltic regions show coordinated relocations inland during peak conflict periods. New settlements were positioned for defense rather than convenience. The entire human geography of the Baltic was reshaped by maritime conflict. Battlefield archaeology at sites like Visby on Gotland provides direct evidence of Baltic raids, destruction layers with Estonian and Curonian artifacts, mass graves with trauma patterns consistent with naval raids, burned churches with coin hoards hidden during attacks. These sites provide physical confirmation of events chroniclers described. DNA analysis of Viking Age populations shows surprising genetic mixing. Estonian genetic markers in Swedish populations, Scandinavian DNA in Baltic regions. The conflict involved not just raiding, but significant population movement through slavery, intermarriage, and settlement. The biological legacy of Viking-Baltic conflict is written in modern genomes. Material culture analysis reveals deep cultural exchange despite ongoing conflict. Estonian pottery techniques influenced Scandinavian production. Viking artistic styles appeared in Baltic metalwork. Religious artifacts show syncretic beliefs combining Norse and Baltic traditions. The archaeological record shows cultural boundaries were far more permeable than political conflicts suggest. Environmental archaeology provides context for the conflict's intensity. Climate data from ice cores and tree rings shows the medieval warm period peaked during the most intense Baltic Viking competition. Favorable climate meant larger populations, more resources for warfare, and better conditions for naval operations. The conflict's intensity was partly environmentally determined. The cumulative archaeological evidence paints a picture of the Baltic Viking conflict as more complex than simple raiding and resistance. This was deep cultural interaction through violence, a centuries-long process of mutual influence and adaptation. Both sides emerged, transformed by the encounter. The archaeology shows us not separate Viking and Baltic stories, but one interconnected narrative of maritime competition and cultural exchange. Modern archaeological techniques continue to reveal new aspects of this conflict. Each excavation adds details that complicate simplistic narratives. The physical evidence increasingly shows the Baltic peoples not as Viking victims, but as equal participants in a complex, violent, but ultimately transformative cultural interaction that shaped medieval Northern Europe. Conclusion: the forgotten naval rivalry. Why this story disappeared. The erasure of Baltic Viking resistance from popular history wasn't accidental. It resulted from systematic biases in how medieval history was recorded, preserved, and retold across centuries. Understanding why this story vanished helps explain why so many assume Vikings conquered everyone they encountered. Christian chroniclers, writing in the 13th and 14th centuries AD, had no interest in glorifying pagan resistance. The official narrative needed to justify the crusades that conquered Estonia and Curonian. Acknowledging that these savage pagans had successfully resisted and even terrorized Christian Scandinavians for centuries would undermine crusading ideology. Better to present them as primitive tribes awaiting Christian civilization. National Romanticism in the 19th century AD focused overwhelmingly on Viking achievements. Sweden, Denmark, and Norway were constructing national identities partly based on Viking Age glory. Stories of Estonian fleets burning Swedish cities, or Curonian pirates terrorizing Danish coasts, didn't fit these narratives. The Vikings needed to be conquerors, not the conquered. National museums, school curricula, and popular literature reflected this bias. Soviet suppression of Baltic national histories from 1940 AD to 1991 AD further buried these stories. Estonian and Curonian maritime achievements were inconvenient for Soviet ideology that portrayed Baltic peoples as historically backward, requiring Russian civilization. Independent Baltic naval power contradicted the narrative of inevitable Russian dominance in the region. Archaeological evidence has only recently been properly analysed with modern techniques. The Salme ships, discovered in 2008 AD and 2010 AD, revolutionized understanding of early Estonian naval capabilities. DNA analysis, isotope studies, and advanced dating methods are revealing complexities that earlier archaeologists missed. The physical evidence of Baltic naval power was literally buried until recent decades. Language barriers have kept primary sources isolated. Estonian and Latvian archaeological reports rarely get translated. Old Norse sagas mentioning Baltic victories remain untranslated or poorly distributed. The fragmentation of evidence across multiple languages has prevented comprehensive synthesis. The oversimplification of Viking Age dynamics in popular culture has created a feedback loop. Every Viking television show, movie, and novel that ignores Baltic resistance reinforces the perception that it didn't exist. The story has disappeared because it was never properly told in the first place. The real lesson. The real lesson of Baltic Viking competition isn't that Vikings were weaker than we thought. It's that the Viking Age Baltic was a complex maritime ecosystem where multiple naval powers competed as equals. The Vikings were extraordinary sailors and warriors. So were the Estonians and Curonians. The collision between these maritime cultures produced one of medieval Europe's longest, most complex naval conflicts. The Baltic wasn't a Viking lake, but contested space where control shifted constantly. Every strait, island, and river mouth was strategically valuable and violently disputed. The geography itself prevented any single power from achieving dominance. The lesson for military history is clear. Naval supremacy in confined waters is nearly impossible to maintain against determined local opposition. Innovation and adaptation flowed in all directions, not just from Vikings to others. Estonians taught Vikings about ice navigation. Curonians demonstrated new piracy tactics. Vikings learned to fear Baltic magic and respect Baltic seamanship. The technological and tactical evolution was mutual, creating hybrid maritime traditions that enriched both cultures. The complexity of medieval Baltic politics defies simple narratives. These weren't unified nations fighting total wars, but shifting alliances of tribes, kingdoms, and merchant cities pursuing overlapping and conflicting interests. Today's enemy was tomorrow's ally. Yesterday's raider was today's trading partner. The complexity should make us skeptical of any simple historical narrative. Technology transfer operated as a two-way street throughout the conflict. Both sides studied captured ships, reverse-engineered weapons, and adopted successful tactics. By the conflict's end, distinguishing Viking from Baltic maritime technology was nearly impossible. They had educated each other through centuries of competition. Geographic advantage proved more important than technological superiority. Estonian control of archipelagos and Curonian domination of river mouths gave them defensive advantages that offset Viking advantages in ship size and weapons. The lesson for strategic studies is timeless. Geography often matters more than technology. The Vikings met their equals on the Baltic waves. Not their superiors, not their inferiors, but their equals. Maritime cultures so similar that their competition lasted centuries without decisive resolution. The stalemate was broken only by external intervention, bringing different forms of warfare. This forgotten rivalry reminds us that historical narratives are constructed, not discovered. The story of unstoppable Viking conquest is a story we've chosen to tell. The story of successful Baltic resistance is equally true, equally dramatic, equally important. It simply hasn't been told. The Vikings met their equals on the Baltic waves.